Hello, everyone. Most welcome to the next panel this afternoon. Following our opening session, we will now have a panel on the theme of consumers or politicians who are the key drivers of change. This is organized by the Raoul Wallenberg Institute and the Sustainability Forum. We will speak about responsibility, drivers and obstacles of change, in the case of sustainable consumption mainly. And we hope for many audience questions so that you can bring up issues that are of interest to you as well in this area. So my name is Magdalena Bexell. I will be the moderator. I am Associate Professor of Political Science here at Lund University. And my current research deals with how countries at the national level adopt the UN-agreed Sustainable Development Goals, which is a key part of the 2030 agenda that the UN General Assembly adopted in 2015. So as a political scientist, I'm interested in issues of responsibility, legitimacy, and political processes around these goals becoming policy tools in a national and local context. We have 3 people with us in this panel. Unfortunately, 2 have had to cancel, as you already know from the previous panel. Parul Sharma had to cancel on short notice, so we're sorry about that. And Liang Xiaoyi, who was on the screen last panel, is now too late, as I understand it, in China too.
But yeah, he was supposed to be here physically, but then didn't get permission to come. So now it's difficult to join because it's very late in the evening now. Yeah,
the time difference is now too big. This is why we have also decided that the panel will end at 4:30 at the latest instead of 5 o'clock. But we're very happy to have the 3 of you here. So we have Johan Jansson, Associate Professor at the Department of Business Administration, and your research deals with sustainable supply chains and drivers of sustainable consumption on the level of individuals. And you already know from the previous panel, Malin, who we now get to ask questions instead of you being the one asking the questions. You're head of the Raoul Wallenberg Institute's Stockholm office and team leader on the team on economic globalization and human rights, but you also have long experience in dealing with business and human rights issues. And you've been the head of the Raoul Wallenberg office in Beijing for many years prior to this. And Songul, you're the head of business development at IM, in particular IM Fair Trade. And you have worked in other capacities with companies such as H&M and IKEA in Turkey, also dealing with supply chain issues. So they represent very broad experience on the topic we'll be speaking about. I will have an introduction to this theme myself before I hand the word over to the panelists to reflect upon a few questions we've asked them to prepare and then open up for discussion with you. But I would like to say a few words of introduction on this theme of responsibility and sustainable consumption first. So I suppose I think it's quite easy to agree on a general level that ideally many share responsibility for advancing society towards more sustainability. So consumers, voters, politicians, companies, researchers, civil society organizations, and international organizations. Yet this panel wants to explore some of the tensions that lie behind the surface when we make such a claim on shared responsibility. So such tensions can appear between politics and markets, between individuals and institutions, between legal and moral responsibility, between global north and south, between polluters and polluted, and between rich and poor. And we know that the negative consequences of consumption tend to fall disproportionately on those who consume the least. So, looking for a second at responsibility, it's both an intriguing and a confusing concept. So it can be understood in a political sense, in a legal sense, or in a moral sense. And these different ways of approaching and understanding responsibility often come together in debates on concrete issues, so that such debates become often quite confusing, in my opinion. I think, for instance, debates on corporate social responsibility, CSR, are often characterized by this tendency to speak past each other, because we use such different concepts and understandings of responsibility, and this is not always clarified. But of course, there are many ways to justify why someone holds responsibility, and it's not obvious which one is most important. So these other ways of justifying responsibility, they usually go beyond the strict legal understanding of responsibility. For instance, to what extent should the fact that someone has caused a particular problem be the source of responsibility of addressing that problem? Such a principle, it would place most responsibility to respond to climate change, for instance, on those who have historically caused climate change than on those who have not. Other principles could be allocated according to closeness. So would it be the case that we have more responsibility towards those who we have close ties to, in any sense of that word? Or is it rather the case that with power comes responsibility, so that having the capacity to take action implies more responsibility? And power can, of course, be material, economic, even moral power, or the know-how, how to take responsibility. There are no clear-cut answers, but these kind of tensions, I think, underpin debates on sustainable consumption, as well as tensions between individual and institutional responsibility. So many individual approaches, I believe, place too much responsibility on the individual consumer, whereas structural views of responsibility tend to neglect the role that consumer power can play in some cases. So, but in the middle, there is a perspective on responsibility that takes into account the social, economic, and institutional context of consumer actions and choices, where I believe it's very important to emphasize the responsibilities of political institutions. They have greater capacities for addressing structural conditions, of course, than do individuals. But such institutions are not given by nature, but shaped by voters, political leaders, active choices. So I would say institutional power does equal more responsibility. Finally, what are the political policy decisions then so far on sustainable consumption? If we look internationally, already Agenda 21, which some of you might recall, adopted in 1992 at the UN Conference on Environment and Development in Rio, spoke about changing consumption patterns. And sustainable consumption has been the concern of many international policy agreements since then. And in 2012, heads of state again adopted a 10-year framework of programs on sustainable consumption and production patterns at a new Rio conference then. And today you might know that one of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals adopted in 2015, goal number 12, says ensure sustainable consumption and production patterns. So this was agreed among all rich and poor states in the UN General Assembly in 2015 and valid until 2030. So looking to Sweden, there are several national plans and strategies in place to promote sustainable consumption, and the budget bill of the Swedish government also raises this issue increasingly. And at the same time, Goal 12 has been identified as the most challenging one of the 17 for Sweden. So Swedish consumption patterns have both national and international implications due to the high number of imported consumption goods. And I would like to recommend a report from last year, June last year, by the Swedish delegation for the 2030 agenda, which until recently was chaired by Pearl Sharma, which has a good discussion on challenges related to sustainable consumption in the Swedish context. So for all students in the audience, whether you end up in politics, in private business, in civil society, or as researchers, you will have to live with this Agenda 2030 for some years now. And I think it's important that you keep a critical and constructive eye on how political leaders, particularly at the national level, but also locally, now what they make out of this long-term agenda, because long-term thinking is certainly needed in this area. So that's some background, and now we've asked the panelists to reflect upon who holds main responsibility for driving change towards more sustainable consumption, and factors that in their experience hinder such change, and what action could be needed to make change come about. So please make notes of any questions you would like to ask later while they speak. And I will also give the three of you an opportunity to reflect on each other's thoughts. So that goes for you too. Would you like to start, Johan?
I thought it was ladies first.
No.
Okay. Sure.
Yeah, no. We'll let you start.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, and thank you for coming here and listening, and hopefully we will have a good discussion and constructive workshop. Let me first, the question, who holds the main responsibility for driving change towards sustainable consumption? That kind of assumes that we know what sustainable consumption is. Do we? What is sustainability? What is sustainable? What is consumption? At least here in Sweden or here in Lund, we consume enormous amounts of resources every day. And what is a sustainable level? Sustainability can be related, of course, to sufficiency, what is enough to just stay alive. So food, water, maybe some clothes when it's cold. But it can also, of course, be related to more psychological issues of well-being, of course. But there is no clear definition today what sustainable consumption is and what is sustainable for a long run. Of course, we put this in perspective of the different targets we have set up in Paris or the Sustainable Development Goals, etc., etc. But there is yet to be defined exactly how much resources can I consume in a lifetime so that it is sustainable. And what we know today is that the consumption levels are extremely unequal. I think you touched upon that a bit. Here in Sweden, we consume enormous amounts of resources. In other countries, it's less, and in other countries, it's even more. We can go into all the numbers. I'm not going to bore you with that. But I think we need to look at this concept of sustainable consumption before we start thinking about who is responsible. So that's like the first point, I think. And then, of course, I need to say something here. And then the question was main responsible, because there is no such thing as one party being only responsible for this development. I mean, all different parties here that have already been mentioned are responsible. But I think if I have to put somebody at the center to be responsible, I wouldn't say the consumer or the producer, the company or the politicians, etc. I would say the individual. Then, of course, the individual is many different things, which we also tend to forget sometimes. So the individual is, to a high extent, consumer. The individual is also a voter that can inform themselves and vote for the parties that can support sustainable consumption. The individual is a researcher sometimes, a teacher sometimes, a parent, a child, etc., etc. What I mean to say is that individuals have roles and are, in that sense, responsible in the different areas where we work in. And I'm going to connect that later on to my ideas on the solutions as well. Politicians are individuals. It's so easy to blame the political system or ask for structural change, but all these people are individuals at the bottom. The least common denominator is that we are individuals. We have certain needs and certain wants that are very common for all of us. And I think we need to find these common denominators in order to move forward. Of course, it's individuals that change structures. It's individuals that change companies. It's individual consumers that buy 10 million iPhones or whatever it is we buy per year. So it's hard to not say that the individual to some extent is responsible. Then, of course, highly educated individuals have more responsibility. Maybe we can discuss that. Individuals with higher income might have higher responsibility. Individuals that have not had the opportunity to go through a good education system might have a lower responsibility, but then others have a responsibility to help them with their responsibility. So I think it boils down to the individual. Is my time up? Can I say one more?
Sure, go ahead.
I also think the individual is not only a consumer. It's very common in where I am studying sustainable consumption and consumers that we always talk about consumers. The individual is also a producer. All of you here are producers. And now you're thinking, what am I producing? I'm usually not knitting scarves or anything. What am I producing? All of you have social media accounts, right? Instagram, Facebook. You are continuously reproducing the consumption society that we are in. That is production. You are helping Facebook and Instagram and all those companies to produce information that is spread, that is helping other people to understand what they should consume. So individuals are also responsible for their production of the cultural symbols or the culture of consumption in that sense. This is very seldomly discussed when we talk about sustainable consumption, because we always focus on the consumption side. But we are part of a culture where we continuously consume things because people influence us to do these choices. I will talk more about social norms and personal norms later on. So change has come very fast when it comes to social media and how we influence and produce information together. So this can also be used as a tool if the individual realizes the responsibility that they have.
Well, I'm sorry, I'm still struggling with my cough, but I'll try to manage. If we think of sustainable consumption then? If the question is what then is sustainable, if that's the first question, then I mean from my perspective, one part of it would be human rights and the protection of human rights. And I think, or the human rights were created to protect individuals from state abuse. There's been some really interesting shifts and dynamics and developments over the past 20 years when we've come to a realization that in relation to sustainable consumption, in relation to human rights, actually companies have more, some really big companies have more leverage, more power than some governments. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about corporate responsibility for human rights. That yes, it is the state, it is governments that have the main obligation to respect, protect and fulfill human rights. But companies, because they have an impact on the enjoyment of human rights, they also have a responsibility. That responsibility looks different than state responsibility to respect, protect and fulfill human rights, namely, as was clarified in the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which were endorsed in 2011 at the Human Rights Council. Companies have a responsibility to respect human rights. So that's different to protecting and fulfilling human rights, but nonetheless, it is part of the responsibility. It is a shared responsibility. So I think there's been enormous progress in the last decade or so on clarifying responsibility in relation to human rights, which is a really important factor when we're talking about sustainable consumption. However, as you were alluding to, that it gets blurred as well, and not to the benefit of furthering human rights, actually. And I think one problem with this blurring around responsibilities when we talk about corporate social responsibility is that there's this assumption that we all want the same thing, that there can be a win-win-win. Companies love to talk about win-win-win, and that, you know, workers and the company and the government, we all share the same interest. Actually, we don't. And I think a really important part of empowering workers or those who have their rights abused is to differentiate between my interests and the company's interests, to be able to negotiate, to be able to bargain, to be able to strike, to create a conflict. And I think this talk about shared responsibility and win-win-win, we all want the same thing. I think it's actually not always beneficial for workers because it confuses and it distracts from some really important fundamental conflicts of interest. And rights, of course, are about power. And for someone to enjoy more rights may mean that someone else has to give up some privilege. So there's a lot of conflicts when we talk about responsibility and rights and CSR that I think are very important to not ignore or try to polish over by this talk about win-win-win. China talks about win-win the whole time in relation to China's growing investments abroad, saying that these are for the good of the countries where we invest. I mean, of course, China has done a lot of good investments in construction, contributing to really important development in countries in Africa, for example. But oftentimes, those investments benefit local elites rather than local communities. And the win-win is often that China wins twice. So I think that's one, the other point I would like to make. And I think the SDGs have that problem. I think it's good, it's progress that we're now thinking about these issues in global terms as I mean, Sweden loves to think about human rights as someone else's problem. Like, we don't have problems here, so we're thinking of human rights as foreign affairs. Human rights responsibility sits with the Ministry for Foreign Affairs in Sweden. Sweden recommends all other countries to establish a national human rights institution, yet Sweden doesn't have one because we don't think we need it, because it's so perfect here. But at the same time, we happily export pollution, social impacts to other countries and still feel good about ourselves for having such a good environment here. So that's very hypocritical, and I think the SDGs and the shared responsibility in making these issues global is important progress in that regard, but it's also problematic.
Thank you. Please.
Yes, I just want to say that I agree with both of you, and the problem is so much bigger than we think. But from an NGO perspective, we think that the responsibility is more the government, because it's about the laws, and the organizations we are working with, they don't have so much power or money, and we have to go back to that. In the end, who have the responsibility and who has the power? The one who has the money is the one today that have the power. And that is also in the political, in the business, in the corporate world. So I think the responsibility in the first is the governments and the corporate. But to do a change, it's the individual person who can make the change, as you said before, and that impact is bigger than we think. It's more powerful than the money, and I like how you explain it in a wider, so I will not go into it. And with the social media, with how we talk about it, our actions, our lifestyles, and also our lifestyle, could we have a lower standard today compared to the rest of the world? Because in Sweden, we have a very high standard. The average of a lifestyle in Sweden is like a rich. We don't see ourselves as a rich, but we are a very rich country, and we have a very good lifestyle. So I think it's, the government in the first, together with the corporate, and also the individual is the one who is the force who can make this change. So the responsibility and who can make the change happen, it's us. Yeah.
Thank you. We also had questions on factors hindering change and what action is needed. Did you have additional comments, as I understood it? You can take both those questions in one round.
I think a good example here is that both of you describe. I mean, if we look at what is actually hindering this, and depending a bit on how we define sustainable consumption, but we have come into a situation where we have a totally unsustainable economic model, and that is what is hindering it on the very high level. This economic model that has served us now for 100 years or so has created enormous financial wealth to some people in the world, some companies, some governments, and has left lots of other people still being extremely poor and trying to grasp for our lifestyle that we have here or that we have in other parts of the world that people look up to. I think, I mean, fundamentally, the economic model as such needs to be changed. I think it was very, very obvious here in the last, in the plenary session before here, that H&M can do only so much within the current economic paradigm. If the economic paradigm is changed, then they might be able to do something else, or there wouldn't be this type of business model overall, because it wouldn't survive. Other types of business models would survive in a totally different economic paradigm. So I think, of course, overall, it's the economic system, and that's why I come down to the individual again, because we have rights. It's a privilege maybe to be able to vote for our politicians, and we have an election now in Sweden soon. where you have the possibility to vote for politicians again. That will change the future, maybe 4 years at least, and to really use that right in order to influence in the direction that we believe is important. Not only voting, but also, of course, influencing politicians. We can do in many ways. We are extremely bad at keeping many thoughts in our heads at the same time. And that's why I need to have my notes here. I mean, all the research, psychological research, etc., shows, of course, this. Usually, if I ask you to name, if I say ketchup, you will think of a certain amount of brands. And if we sit for a long time, you will come up with about 7 brands of ketchup. Usually, you can only name 3 or 4, maybe. Maybe if you're not a ketchup expert or whatever. But I mean, somewhere around there. And this is also a barrier towards change. It's because that media, social media, all types of media, continuously move the searchlight back and forth to different issues. And 99.9% of all those issues are of totally no relevance to all of us. But we don't say that. We let them sit on TV and discuss the Nobel Committee in Sweden for hours and hours and hours, and how they have harassed each other or not have harassed each other, etc., etc. How does that bring us forward? It's an interesting documentary, soap opera, maybe. Some entertainment. Yes, we need some entertainment as well. I'm not totally radical in that sense. But the media searchlight needs to continuously focus on the sustainability issues. The companies need to continuously communicate how they can help us, individuals, other companies, governments, etc., work with sustainable consumption. We need to talk about this all the time, all the time, all the time, in order for it to be on top of the agenda. For the Swedish election now this fall, I think environmental sustainability issues are around 11, 12, 13, 14th most important issue when they ask Swedish people. And it's funny that without the environment, without our resources, we have no elections. We have nothing. So, I mean, it's funny that question is not on the top. It says something about how we see about these issues. We don't have a financial economic system without environmental resources or energy. Which says something here of the barrier that we are facing against. And here we need lots of responsibilities from lots of different parties, I think, in our different roles, as I was connecting to before.
Yes. Malin, what are your thoughts on factors that hinder change and that can drive change?
I think a lot of us feel, at least me, I feel overwhelmed by just trying to grapple, and I work with this on a daily basis, but I struggle to get my head around where does it begin and where does it end, and how do we get from here to there. I certainly feel really overwhelmed, not the least because things are changing so fast now as well. So what used to be truths 10 years ago just aren't anymore. I mean, where a lot of the assumptions that we as a human rights organization have based our work on, they're not true anymore. When we started the Raoul Wallenberg Institute in the early 1980s, there was this drive towards democratization and human rights and international collaboration and international institutions. And I mean, it's an equally fundamental paradigm shift going on now, but in the other direction. So what does that mean for us as a human rights organization when when, you know, the world's one of the two biggest powers in the world is also a dictatorship, China. It's an economic superpower, but it's also a country that doesn't respect freedom of expression, freedom of association. It's very influential now in terms of its leverage and impact and influence on international institutions like the United Nations. What does that mean? What can we do? And at the same time, we have the US countries in Europe. They used to be the the countries we trusted to put pressure on governments that weren't respecting human rights, we can't. I mean, there's no credibility for the US to sort of criticize other countries. It really lacks credibility. So I feel a bit overwhelmed about how, one, because everything is shifting and it's happening very, very fast. And so many assumptions on which we have based our methods, putting pressure on governments, name and shame. I mean, the majority of governments these days seems to be shameless. They don't care if they're seen to be respecting human rights. So, yeah, I feel a bit overwhelmed. I mean, I'll end on a more positive note. I have some ideas as well, but I do feel one big obstacle is that it's so overwhelming. It's so big. You feel very insignificant as an individual. I fully accept that me as an individual, I have responsibility, but I also, on the big scale of things, you feel when even H&M feel powerless to act, to really have an influence on this economic system that we all have to work under, then as an individual, you can certainly feel very powerless as well. Yeah.
And from civil society perspectives, what kind of factors hindering change would you like to highlight?
Yeah, it's still like we are working. It's about empowering people, because the organizations still that we are working with, they are like very weak economically, and to be able to change their own situation, there needs a lot of changes from the governments and again from the corporate together and from the civil society. But I also would like to, what factor hinders such a change? I want to go back to that. I think I see that I don't, it sounds very dark, but I see with the new generation, I see a very strong force that are value-based and not profit-based. So I feel like there is change already, maybe not that huge that we would like to, we who have destroyed me also, so would like to see, but there is a very big change coming, and you are putting the new generation with a value-based, with a sharing economic lifestyle, because the lifestyle that we built up is not sustainable. That's what we can see, and when I mean lifestyle, it's how we eat, how we shop, how we travel, how we live, the houses. Today we have the sharing economy where young people, they don't want to own, the millennials, they don't want to own anything in the same way when you measure from my generation, the 70s. So I want to just put a little bit sunshine over this, that I see a change coming, and I have hope for the future, together with you, of course. You are the driving force. So.
And Malin, did you want to add some? You said you wanted to add something positive note.
No, but of course there are those drivers as well that are really important, including social media. But social media, as has also been evidenced in recent years, can be used. It's not a neutral, or it is a neutral. Sorry, it is a neutral, because it's a tool that can be used for good or for bad. So I think maybe we've been a little bit naive or too optimistic in our assumption that social media will be a good tool for all the good things, bring about democracy, information, because a lot of people don't actually use the tool in that way. A lot of people use it for distraction, to just, you know, scroll and be entertained, and not really to inform yourself or empower yourself or organize. Yeah. But yeah, of course, those are new possible potential drivers, but not necessarily forces for good, but very powerful drivers for something.
Yeah. Did you want to remark on that?
Yeah, with the social media, I think it's more powerful than we think, due to when you look at sellings and profits, and today everybody's talking about influencers, and influencers are on social media, and the lifestyle that they have, the impact that the influencer has today is huge when you look at the marketing and to make an impact and about the lifestyle. So I think the social media has more impact than maybe we think. I don't have a research, that's my...
No, but I agree,
yeah.
it has impact,
yeah.
but not necessarily positive impact is my point.
No.
I mean, it's a very powerful tool, but it's also used and abused.
Yeah,
Trump is a major influencer
yes.
on social media.
But also it's maybe good so we know that that kind of people are out there. And so we know how to approach. And hopefully we will not have a government like that.
And Johan, your research, does it say something about drivers of change for sustainable?
Yeah, it does, but I just want to comment here back first.
Sure, okay.
Because I think, I mean, many people can react just like you did now, that we talk about the individual and the responsibility and you feel overwhelmed. I mean, it's very easy to do that, and not only this issue, in many issues, because there's so much information today to take in different regards. And I mean, I'm not saying that we should feel overwhelmed, but it's okay. It's a realization at least, and it's also a problem awareness kind of process where you realize that this is bigger. But usually the best way to think about this is to I don't want to put all the responsibility on the individual as such, even if we are well educated, etc. But I mean, within the box where I work, where I have my influence, I can do this and this and this. That can be enough from my perspective. If I am a teacher, a researcher, I can do these things, and I can do that as good as I can and as much time as I can, and that can be good enough from that perspective. Because we have so many areas where we move around all the time, so that can help you feel a little bit less overwhelmed, I would say. It's hard to influence Trump or China directly, but indirectly, very many together of us can. We had on the session before the example of Apple, for example. I mean, Apple was nothing 15 years ago. It's the consumers, it's the individuals that have driven Apple to what it is today. It would be nothing without the individuals. Yeah. Did the individuals know about the suicides in China? At the Foxconn factories, etc., etc. Did they know about this? We can discuss that. It's not what they search for on social media, at least, but the information is out there if we want it, and that's what I'm saying about the individual and the responsibility. If we come into some solutions, there has been probably no other time in history where you can find so much information about products, etc., and goods as you can today. Yet we hear that people want even more information. We heard that on the last session. We want even more information from H&M to tell us how much CO2 per garment, how was it transported, what is the content, how bad are the chemicals, what happens when you recycle it, etc., etc. But when we look at how consumers behave, they don't search for this information. They say they want it, but they don't search for it, and they don't factor it in when they make their decisions. So to some extent, it has to be already factored into the model, so the consumers that don't want it, 8 to 10% of the consumers, they care enough to search for it, but 8 to 10% of the consumer group is not going to change the world. So we need it to be included in the system as such. But this is about norm change. It's about changing our norms on what is important in society, and we do that all the time, but we don't realize that. In Sweden, we have gone from 40 to 50% of the grown population smoking about 40, 50 years ago. And now we're down to about 8, 10, 11, 12%. Some subgroups it's higher. That has worked through regulation change. It has worked with banning advertising and marketing from tobacco companies, raising the price on the tobacco, making it harder to smoke in restaurants. When the regulation came that you cannot smoke in restaurants anymore, except in certain areas, the restaurant owners, everybody in Sweden, were totally mad at the regulators and the governments for doing this, because they thought they would lose 30-40% of the revenue in the restaurant. What happened? They increased the revenues in restaurants with 15 to 20% the month after. Why? Because there were so many people out there that had allergies and problems that could not go to the restaurant because everybody was smoking. Now they could go out to the restaurant. I talked to people that hadn't been to a restaurant for 20 years. They went out and had a dinner at a restaurant because they weren't smoking anymore. So it's about norm change. We can change these norms. We can change the consumption norms in a similar fashion. It's just that we need to wake up to the possibility that we have, I think. Yeah.
And that started, the smoking, the change started with trade unions among flight attendants, apparently, who wouldn't take those working conditions, working on a plane where people were smoking. So again, the important role of trade unions in actually changing
and also the
things.
restaurant unions.
Yeah, yeah.
Because the restaurant unions in the restaurants were saying the same thing. Our employees have a job that kills them. Yeah. They die slowly, but they die from working. So we can't have that anymore. Yeah. And I mean, if I continue, I think there are so many possibilities of both finding products and companies that take responsibility. That really try to do this. And individuals and then consumers and voters, they need to reward these companies. They need to be rewarded, even if they don't do the best thing, the first thing they do. I hate to make commercial, but I'm going to do that anyway. This is a Fairphone. How many have heard about the Fairphone? Oh, well, this is a specific...
It's a special audience.
I'm also...
Yeah, this is a bad target group in that area. Yeah. But you're here, you've heard about it. But most people I talk to, they've never heard about conflict minerals in telephones and laptops. They've never heard about the issues surrounding these mines in Africa or the labor conditions when they put them together in Foxconn in China, wherever it is. But the information is out there. There are companies trying to make a solution. We need to reward them as well. Look for the information and reward them. And don't maybe demand that they do the perfect solution the first time around, because nobody can. So even if they don't do it perfect the first time, they can still be rewarded in a certain sense. Same thing with individuals. Usually there are these lists what you can do as a consumer to lower your CO2 footprint or things like that. Once I had an Aftonbladet list, Aftonbladet, Swedish newspaper, they had a 10-point list, and it was like higher your tire pressure in your car. That will save you 1% of the fuel. So higher pressure. And do eco driving, and maybe you can eat a little bit less meat, etc., etc. On all those lists, the most important thing is not there. And that is what we have been discussing here. That is social influence. It's not on the list, but that is the most important thing we can do. Influence each other to be the change we want to be. It sounds very fluffy, very, I mean, not very research-wise, scientific, whatever you want to hear. But that is what is happening around us all the time. Companies know this. Marketing agencies know this. This is what they use. That's why they hire influencers. Yeah. This is what they know. It's funny that we don't know it, or the individuals don't think about it, how influenced they are, and how much influence you can be on others. So if somebody is a vegetarian, encourage them to be a vegetarian. Ask why, how they did it, how it works. If you can be it, maybe as well. Influence others to do it. If somebody tries to go at the forefront, encourage them to walk that path. It's not easy. The first people that didn't want to smoke in the restaurants, or the first restaurants that banned smoking before there was a regulation, how did they do it? Instead of seeing them as non-normal, see them as the new change, the new normal in the future. That is, I think, is the change we need.
Thank you. Yeah. We'll let the audience in now, and I also want to say that
I agree.
If someone is watching live stream on the Sustainability Forum Facebook page, you can post questions in the commentator field, and Jenny will see it. All right, so please introduce yourself, what you study or where you work, and put a brief, succinct question to the panel members. Let's see who wants to start. We have a microphone over there. Please.
Hello, my name is Karis. I work in the Department of Marketing at Business Administration with Johan. I'm a PhD student. I didn't actually have a question, but I just wanted to say thank you very much for the discussion so far. I think it's really, really important points you've put up here. And the point about the fact that we influence people all around us every day, I think is fantastically important to remember. We can't just rely on other people to do this for us. We must be the change that we want to see. So thank you very much.
There is one in the middle. Okay. And then Jenny, there is one down here. Please. Yeah.
Okay. Hi. My name is Swapno. I'm a exchange student studying computer engineering from the United States. I was wondering if you thought it was if it's fair for a state to impose these like a regulation or something to create a more sustainable future upon a consumer. If it was, I guess, maybe fair to maybe increase like maybe the burden of maybe paying higher taxes or paying for more sustainable materials upon the consumer.
Who would like to respond to that?
I want to hear what you say.
Please, Malin.
Yeah, all governments do all the time. So it's just about expanding. I mean, that's what governments are for, and legislation is for. But of course, there's political variations on, for example, taxes now in Sweden on domestic flights. But it's the sort of libertarians or the people on the conservative political side of the spectrum who pretend as if this is Big Brother, the state imposing things on us. I think that's an extremely superficial way of looking at it. And yeah, we already, that's how societies work. That's how rule of law works. That's how we develop in societies, so there's already a lot of existing regulations, and so it's just a matter of developing those so that they're in step with global developments around climate change, and
Sure.
so yeah. But I think it's totally fair and just to impose.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a little bit. Where could we see like the line between? I remember. You talked about how when you have more privilege and more money, more power, you have more responsibility to create a more sustainable future. So where do you draw a line between maybe the people who can afford to be a driving factor in creating a sustainable future, and who should we say maybe does not have the resources to create a sustainable future? Maybe there are some people living in developing countries who may not be able to afford to live a privileged, sustainable life that maybe some people can in these developed countries.
Yeah.
Songul, would you like to say something on that?
It's very hard to put a level on it or on the standard, but what we are working with NGOs is like we support the partner organization in different countries, and in different countries there are different issues addressed. So we support them to be able to empower the partner organization to fight for what they think is right for them. So and it's hard because it's about money. We need money. I will come back to that. It's very tough we have a very huge challenges to empower the civil society, but we are not giving up, and we have a fantastic partner organization that I have been told. I will not go into details, but there are organizations that I adore. The women organization that fight for the gender's right, the equal rights, and what they risk. So from an NGO point of view, it's more we try to, through the partner organization, and to work with Sweden, also with the government, to do changes within the human rights in the countries, and we get the information and what the main issues are from the partner organizations. So I don't know if it's answer to your question, but
Johan, you want to add something?
Yes, I think the number is $25,000 per year.
you have
Net
that.
income. That is the line. No, I'm just kidding. There is no line, of course.
There is no. I was like, I missed that.
But that is a number that has been thrown around in the debate, I know.
Yeah.
No, what I want to say is the poor people of this planet, they emit very little. So they have very little responsibility, in my view. Average Bangladeshian eats 3 kilos of meat per year. In Sweden, we are around 75 to 80 kilos per individual per year. That means that we have a multitude of much more responsibility if we only look at meat consumption now. So I don't see that as a problem. The problem is that the wealth is unequally distributed. We have built up this wealth, and we now have a responsibility to help others to come to a certain level, not to come to an unsustainable consumption level, but to come to a sustainable consumption level, because I would say many of those are below the sustainable consumption level. You can be below it and you can be above it, of course. If you don't have enough nutrients in your diet, education system, healthcare systems, etc., then of course you need to come to that level. And we have the tools and the knowledge to help in order to do that. Now it's just a question of actually making those tools available and giving the organizations that have the knowledge the resources to do that.
Civil society organizations.
Yeah, for example, there was an interesting documentary a few months back about Indonesia, and their tobacco farmers, tobacco plantations. You can see it on SVT Play still, I think. Because your first question was about the money and the tax, and their calculation was that the tobacco industry gives Indonesia this amount of money every year, X amount of millions of US dollars exporting tobacco. However, people smoking are smoking more and more in Indonesia, and we have a healthcare system that is not very efficient. So we're actually paying a lot more than the money that we're making on tobacco, trying to take care of all these people that are getting lung cancer and other diseases from smoking. So it's financially, economically a very bad model. So we need to raise the tax on smoking so we can at least pay for a healthcare system that these companies give rise to. So in that sense, it's not an easy calculation, but in that sense, polluter pays, or the one that destroys the system needs to pay into the system in order to make it work. But these are value definitions that we make together all the time. Who should pay? Should it be the tobacco industry, the alcohol industry that causes damage, the car industry, the flights we're on here? So who should actually pay for these things, the emissions or the problems that they are causing now and into the future?
And Malin, you wanted to add?
Yeah, I think maybe adding to what you just said, and maybe I misunderstood your question before, so I just wanted to add that Hans Rosling, who passed away recently, he always used to say that the 3 letters more important than CSR are TAX. So if companies just stopped doing these charity projects, and that's what the business and human rights agenda is about at its core as well, rather than having CSR projects, nice little projects that the companies do to the side of their business as usual operations. They should integrate a human rights perspective into their operations. They should pay tax in the local societies where they operate, where they do their business. So stop with the CSR projects to compensate for the pollution and the negative social impact you've had, and just pay tax, and that would actually that would have much more effect than CSR projects.
Yeah, and it's certainly a big issue in debates and policies on financing the Sustainable Development Goals, is issue of tax capacity across the world among governments. Now we have a next question over there.
Oh, hi. Thank you very much for the talk. It's been enlightening. My name is Anton. I study practical philosophy with an extra interest in climate ethics and responsibility. Was it Johan?
Mm.
Yeah. You started out with a very individualistic view, like reducting itself to individuals who bear the responsibility foremost. And I'm just interested in how you see because you shifted a bit, talking about corporations and norm change. And so how do you see collectives like states, corporations, since when we're talking about backward-looking responsibility, like causal history responsibility, it's very meaningful to talk about states, as now we have in the US people saying it's not my president, they're trying not to be part of that state. Do they still bear the responsibility, the individual? When you talked about norm change, it was the government who went in and changed the smoking ban.
Only partly, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So how do you see collectives, movements, responsibilities?
Now we'll try to give a bit briefer answers, so we have because we have many remaining questions.
I'll try to be short.
Yeah.
No, social norms is, of course, it's about the collective. It's not only that. I mean, it's the government. When it comes to the smoking, it's the government forming the regulation based on also what voters, doctors, unions, etc., are saying to them. So it's based on an understanding of what the collective will is, of course, and also. If you light up a cigarette in here, what's going to happen? You're going to get the evil eye from the audience, and then maybe somebody with more power is going to throw you out. That is the force of the social norm. That is what you do to people that don't conform to the norm. But now in many consumption situations we are conforming to the wrong norm. So these people that are actually doing that need to be the front runners in the future, because maybe today they are doing the right thing. That was the norm issue. What was it else you asked about? Yeah. I mean, this has been going on for a long time. When we have a political scientist here, I mean, it's very hard. It has been very hard historically to put companies in front of the judicial system and convict them of what they have done collectively. Enron, WorldCom, we have so many examples. What they do in the US, they put the individuals that have made most of the bad decisions in jail instead. I mean, there is an individual behind all these things. It's very easy to be a collective, Volkswagen, Dieselgate, to be a collective and hide behind the facade of a brand. These people, I would say we need to hold more personal individual accountability in that sense as well. Who were those people that made those decisions? Can they look themselves in the mirror? Are they the people they want to be in this change? So, of course, these things work together. But yeah.
Yeah.
Short answer. Sorry.
Brief.
Yeah, just to add to that on collectives. I mean, now that we've seen this trend in the last few years where governments all of a sudden backtrack on human rights, on their responsibility in relation to human rights, cities stepping up. I mean, I think human rights, that's one of my optimistic points, is that cities have stepped up, not just on climate and environmental issues, but on Muslim ban, and that's very interesting. Just like some companies are stepping up to take responsibility where responsibility is being abandoned by nation states. So you have cities, you have companies. So there are new collectives that are taking on responsibility.
It's because within these cities and companies there are individuals that is driving this change. And they see that if Trump doesn't do it, we need to do it, and I can do it within my collective, and then we can affect the change. So it's behind all this is an individual finding peers.
Yes, Songul.
From the human right perspective, I just want to add, I read it this morning, that Vogue magazine, on the cover, they have a woman with hijab for the first time in the history. So that's out. So once again.
Yeah. Now we will collect a few questions from here. I think you had one, and you also had a question, and you had one.
Bonjour.
Oh my God! Now there are many questions. Okay. Brief questions. We will collect
try to make it
3
short.
and brief answers. You'll give the mic then to your neighbor. Yes.
Hi, I'm Jacob. I'm an exchange student from Canada, and I'm studying mechanical engineering. My question is, what action should we, and when I mean we, I mean more the government, take to incite companies to be more sustainable? Because basically the companies are the one that has the biggest impact on the consumption and like the impact on the environment. So we should incite them to move, to do something about it. I was wondering what are the actions that we have taken already and what the government should maybe implement more from your point of view.
Okay, and next.
Hi. I'm Emily Turgaman-Grian. I work with human rights and sustainability in my own company called All Rights Consulting. I have a comment and a question. The comment is about the fact that we are also non-consumers. More and more of us are non-consumers, those 8 to 10% researching our consumer choices. Yeah. So what is interesting there, I think, is, for instance, H&M saying that they don't see any results on their sustainability actions, when actually maybe those of us looking for sustainable purchases wouldn't go to H&M in the first place, and we're consuming less. Maybe we're not consuming what they have at all. So I mean, we have that aspect as well. We don't all want to be consumers anymore. Yeah. I work with fair trades, and the fair trade stores see decreased sales because their consumers consume less. But so the question is rather, so there are those 10% of us trying to make better choices, and we want to inspire. We don't want to blame. Yeah, we don't want people to feel sorry about flying. We want to inspire them to take the train instead. We don't want them to feel bad about eating meat. But how do we do that? It's so different to raise your voice on this without having other people feel bad. How do we reach out and saying, well, you know, sustainability is the good thing. That's the desirable lifestyle.
We'll add 2 brief questions from you and you, so please keep it brief.
Philip, I study industrial management. I have a quick question to mostly Johan, but the others as well. You said that we have an unsustainable economic model, and we're trying to make changes, add taxes, subsidies, but is it even possible to fix the inherent flaws that we find in capitalism, or we do have to change the model entirely in the long run?
In front of you.
Mine is relating to the last one. It's can destructive lobbying be hindered within our economic paradigm?
Great, very big questions.
I didn't hear.
Very
what
good.
Did you say?
Destructive
it's
lobbying.
relating to what you said about our economic paradigm, and it's whether destructive lobbying can be hindered within it.
Now you will pick some aspect to answer. Would you like to, Songul, to reply to one of these? Or
yes, I would like to answer your question about how. I think that the government should support this different kind, like fair trade organizations and different kind of sustainable movements that are within the society. I think that they need extra support from the governments and from different organizations, maybe less tax or others to highlight it and to be able to, because the big challenges, as you also maybe have faced, is to reach out to the people, because we don't have that profit that huge industrial company has. So we don't have the same money to go out and work with influencers, so we don't have the same impact. So I think from that part, it has to be very specific from the government side that this department would only work with sustainability to how do we make the impact, how do we change the norms, to have a head with people from corporate, people from fair trade, from NGO, and to have that kind of setup to drive the change and the norms. Because we, as you say, the behavior of a consumer, it takes 5 minutes. I need this. You just go and buy it. And afterward, when you start to think, it was like maybe not so good purchase, but we still do it. Out of the comfort zone, how do we change it? So I think we all together.
Would you like to give a response to one of these?
One on what should the government do? I mean, just one thing is looking at the government as also a commercial actor. The state is a really, really important commercial actor through public procurement. So it has a lot of leverage in improving its own purchasing practices and making sure that we're not buying tools to hospitals, textiles to hospitals, schools, universities that are produced in an unethical, non-sustainable way. I think that's the major role of governments. And then the other aspect is, I mean, the big debate now around business and human rights is that voluntary commitments and voluntary actions by companies has taken us a long way, but it can only take us so far. So there is a need for regulation, there is a need for legislation, and we're looking at one thing is, should the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights be turned into an actual treaty? I'm not sure that's the best way forward, because international treaties on human rights tend to be very weak and tend to take forever to negotiate anyway. So I think, but some kind of smart mix between voluntary commitments and regulation is necessary. So yeah, so those two things: more smart regulation policy mixes, and then the state as a commercial actor. Yeah. And the state has, I mean, states are supposed to supervise the companies and put in place legislation to make sure that business respect human rights. So the ultimate responsibilities still lie with the state and government. Yeah.
Briefly, Johan?
Yes, I mean, the government, I agree. I mean, good that that comes up. But then, of course, the government is continuously changing. The election times are too short. You don't, I mean, we're talking sustainability issues, we're talking hundreds, thousands of years perspective, and now we're talking 4-year cycles. That is one of the problems that we need to change maybe in the political system, accountability for longer time periods. And that means that if it was a longer time period, maybe you would be able to implement more radical policy measures. There is usually more support in the voting population, I would say, for radical policy measures than the politicians sitting in office right now think. We have some examples. Smoking is one example. Stockholm's congestion charges are another example. Stockholm didn't have congestion charges before. They had a trial period of 6 months. Before that, everybody said it's going to be terrible. It's going to detract from the economy. People are going to be furious because they have to go on the subway. It's the best public transportation system in Sweden. They implemented it for this trial period. The traffic decreased by 18 to 20%. Companies loved it. Why did companies love it? Because their company cars could go much faster between the stores and their locations. So they actually earned more money. Schenker, the biggest transportation company, put 15 of their trucks in a parking lot and said, we don't need them anymore, because they were just standing around in traffic. So when they asked people before if they wanted these policy measures, they didn't want them. They implemented it, people loved it, now it's permanent. We need to think about this radical, I don't know if that is a radical policy change, but at least it's something more than the norm was before. So if you ask people what they really want, of course I don't want this tomorrow because it can hurt me tomorrow, but in 2020, in 2025, I can accept it. So if we understand that path, I think governments can do much more in that sense. The paradigm shift and economy and capitalistic system. Yeah, that's of course. I mean, that is the tough question. It has given us enormous, or certain parts of the world, enormous wealth, healthcare systems, longer expected life expectancy. It has taken care of lots of the problems, and has created enormous amounts of debt in another part of the system. So how we use resources, climate change, carbon dioxide, etc., etc. There are experiments going on in the UK, for example, with a more local economy, where you build them on a more of a barter system, where it's less reliant on taxes, and you can actually cut down on work hours, etc., to have a better life. Maybe it can be done within the current system. I mean, everything here, what we do, and this discussion here, it's a big experiment of what we can do, because the future that we're going into, we haven't been there before. So everything is an experiment. So maybe we can experiment with the economic model to a certain extent. Cutting down work hours would cut down consumption, because it would mean that we have a bit less income. And there is some discussions about this. On the other hand, we have so much wealth already acquired. So if we work 30 hours a week instead of 40, we would probably use those 10 extra hours to consume even more. Because we would go skiing and we would go on holidays, etc., etc. Okay. So that's a rebound effect. So it's not easy. But that would be a fundamental change of the economic system, at least, to work less, earn less, consume less. I mean, we need to turn down the resource consumption wheel. Technology will get us a certain level, circular economy, those types of ideas will get us to a certain part, but not so far. And then you had a question about lobbying.
Yeah, very briefly,
yes,
because I want the final round.
Lobbying and...
The role of lobbying in...
The role of lobbying. I don't know what I'm going to say about that. Yeah.
I think regulations would be the answer to
and
lobbying and how to deal with that. Laws.
And also strong individuals with integrity. I mean, we had a philosophy student here. I mean, very much of our society is a consequential-based society. We look at the consequences of the decisions we make. We need to look much more on the people that we want to be, and the people that we vote into office or end up in company boards, etc., etc. Maybe not think so much about the consequences, but instead of if they can look themselves in the mirror. I think this needs to be discussed much more. Virtue, ethics, or whatever you would call it.
Okay, we won't have room for everyone's questions, unfortunately, but we'll have a final round of 3 brief questions, and then we'll wrap up after that. So, yes, please.
Hi, yes, thank you for the discussion. My name is Victoria, and I'm studying environmental studies and sustainability science here in Lund. And my question just revolves around what you were talking about, the importance and the impacts of social media. And I'm wondering whether politics have a role in producing and consuming information in these platforms. Do they, and should they maybe?
And
Hi, my name is Emma Darling. I'm working at Tetra Pak Responsible Sourcing Capital Equipment, and I am curious.
Speak a bit closer.
Sorry, Emma Darling and Tetra Pak Responsible Sourcing Capital Equipment. I'm wondering on your view on blockchain and how that can change this topic moving forward.
Hi, I'm Katja. I study human rights at Malmö, and it's just kind of a observation. It's funny, at a panel on sustainability, we'll have plastic cups,
I agree.
single-use
totally
cups.
Agree.
And I've seen that around the rest of the university. And I was just thinking that it's a very simple decision just to not even think about something like this. And I mean, everyone has the opportunity to just think a tiny bit more and change their behavior, but do you think it's more people readily do things more readily if there's policies in place, or do you think like a culture of sustainability is enough to make people change their habits, or do you think there has to be some top-down effect from the government to make people change?
Very good questions again, thank you. And this will also be your final word, so I'll give each of you just a few minutes to respond to.
Yeah, regarding the social media, and I believe in democracy, so I think the regulation should not come, there shouldn't be a regulation from the governments on social media, but I think that the government should support the different organizations more and help them to, and highlight them and help them to be seen in the social media maybe to support. But the regulation, yeah, it's a fine line when you come to democracy.
Yeah, I actually had a look at this morning. I was wondering, I wonder if Lund University has a sustainability policy. Let's have a look. And it took, because I was thinking about transparency and the discussions we were going to have about transparency in the panel before. And one important aspect of transparency is that you make information very easily accessible and available. So I should be able to go into Lund University's the first page that I land on. There should be the sustainability policy and report. Wasn't there. Googled Lund University sustainability report. Nothing came up. There is an environmental policy, but that's different to what I would consider as like a comprehensive sustainability policy. And the sustainability policy that exists is extremely short. It's a few paragraphs. There's no sustainability report, I think, produced by Lund University.
From what I know, a strategy is under elaboration.
Yeah. So I think that would be, I mean, that's very interesting. We have a sustainability week here. Why is there no proper sustainability policy and report, which I think would help? I mean, then we wouldn't probably be having plastic cups. So I don't think it's an either or, like, is it top down or bottom up? I think it can happen in mysterious ways, how change comes about. But I do think policies help, legislation helps, for sure, to make choices easier. You know, you don't have to every time as an individual think for yourself, oh, what cups should we use? There's an easy policy, it's made available, so you can make easier choices as an individual.
Yes, no, I agree. I mean, you talked about taxes before. It makes it, I mean, to some extent now we have a tax on flying in Sweden, finally. Very small amount, but it makes it a bit easier to fly. I mean, I used to climate compensate when I had to fly. I tried to fly as little as possible. And it's quite complicated to do that every year, the climate compensation. Now I can feel a bit better that at least some of the flight now is actually going back to some kind of environmental work. We'll see what happens. Social media and governments. Yes, to some extent it is already regulated what influencers can do online and not. They actually have to say now when they are sponsored. So when the things that you follow, they have to say when they are sponsored, when they get paid for talking positively about the company, etc., etc. Can governments act more on social media? I think definitely they can. But we see when we do research on this, and I've actually had some students that actually worked with Tetra Pak on this as well, that people don't want to follow what they think are boring topics. So it needs to be done in a very good and a fun way then. And that is the issue you were touching upon before. How do we make this desirable? We cannot blame people. But I would say we would all get a much better life if we come to a better sustainable consumption level. In many regards, but it's very hard for us to visualize what that would be like. But I don't mind going to a restaurant and not being blown smoke in my face, for example. I don't mind walking in the street and there's an electric car passing me instead of a diesel car polluting me. So, I mean, all these things will make life so much better for us. And that is just up to the companies, the governments, and us all, of course, to see the positive change in this. I mean, 70s, 80s, many companies tried to sell this by blaming getting people to think about this, it can't be done anymore. So I think the companies that are succeeding in selling more green products than others, or taking the responsibility, are doing it in a more optimistic, positive way. We have a great possibility to change. Blockchain came up. Interesting. I think blockchain can help this system enormously, because then we can track all the ingredients in a product. We can track all the transactions along the way, in the entire supply chain. But I know way too little about blockchain technology to say that this is good and this is bad. But I think it's very promising development in that sense. Plastic cups. Can I end with the plastic cups? When I walked over to have coffee, it was paper cups. Yeah, I talked to the guy who was standing there about that for my 5 minutes over there. When I came to Lund University about a year and a half ago, so I know too little about the sustainability work here. But I worked at the Umeå University before, and the Umeå School of Business and Economics. And we did an environmental certification of the entire business school, ISO 14001, which is not very ambitious, but it was interesting work, and we got the certification. When we had discussion, what is our environmental impact? What is the sustainability impact that we have? We came up with flights, for example, the research we do. Of course, the students we influence. If we can get students, my economy business students, if they can become leaders of change in the future, that can have a much higher impact than some other things we do. When we invited students to come in and discuss this with us, they talked about plastic cups and printing on both sides of the paper. It's very interesting to read about this also in the literature, because there are symbolic issues and then there are issues that really matter. But symbolic issues also matter. So this plastic cup is not a huge carbon dioxide emitter or a problem, really, but it is a symbolic issue that says something about this entire event. So we need to work on both issues at the same time. But we know what, in sustainable consumption terms, we need to work with. It's the transportation, the flying, the cars, the fossil fuels. It's the meat consumption and the way also we handle the land use, etc., from agriculture. And it's, of course, the heating and the cooling of our buildings, the energy use as such. I mean, if we can work with those, and then if we want to go further, we can look at our investments. When you get your pension money, where do you put it? Talking about the economic system. Do you put it in companies like Royal Dutch Shell or British American Tobacco? Where do you want to put your pension money? What do you believe in? Or do you want to put it in other companies that work for a change? And also, of course, the last issue, in Sweden we talk about 5 Bs. The last issue is the barnet, the baby, the population issue. The more people we are on the planet, the more we consume. Maybe I should end there. That usually raises lots of questions. Thank you.
And I would like to conclude by saying how glad I am to see to hear all your good questions, and to remember that all of you can take responsibility for bringing these issues into political debate, now that we have upcoming Swedish national elections in September, and you can all discuss these issues with your fellow students and, of course, anyone else. So you can make a contribution in that sense.
And demand a proper sustainability policy and report from Lund University.
That you can do to your teachers and all the departments where you're studying. So join me in thanking the panel.